Okay, well, hello everyone. My name's Andy Williams. I've recently joined the management board of a company called Titania. We're a very small but fast-growing cybersecurity software company that's based in Worcester in the UK. We're part of the Malvern-Worcester cyber cluster, if you've heard of that. And I'm going to be spending the next 10 minutes talking about the law of unintended consequences when it comes to auditing the security of companies' networks. In order to do that, I'm going to spend the first minute talking a little bit about what we do, because I think it'll help contextualize the observations I'm going to make in the following 9 minutes. So we're a very young company, as I mentioned. We started in 2009, but already we're now operating in 45 countries around the world. What we do is help companies audit their networks, both for security vulnerabilities, but also for compliance against either their own internal security policies or increasingly the best practice standards, some of which are mandatory depending on the industry you work in. So for example, if you work in the payment card industry, you'll typically look to be compliant with the PCI standard. If you're in, as many of our clients are in the American military, you have to comply with a standard called STIG. So depending on whether you're complying with your own standards or industry standards, we help you do that. And what we bring to the party is the rapid automation of that process. So our software allows you to audit your networks very quickly, but as importantly, I think, certainly for penetration testers who are many of our clients, to automate the reporting process. Sometimes it will take hours and days to assess a network, and potentially weeks to write a report with all of the security vulnerabilities identified and reported and advised against. We do all that in seconds, and that's basically what we do. So we typically work with large corporate businesses and government agencies and so on, but as I've already mentioned, many of our clients are security consultants and penetration testers who use our software to audit other companies' networks. We are typically used in the defense and homeland security environment, critical national infrastructure, finance, telecoms, IT, the big kind of technology-based corporations, effectively. As you can see, 90% of our business outside the is outside the UK, and the bulk of it is in the US. My connection with all that is that prior to joining this company, I worked for 6 years at the American Embassy in London, where I was involved as one of my roles, helping to promote increased collaboration between UK and US commercial cyber businesses on joint projects, etc., and also in terms of collaboration with academia. So those are the types of customers that we deal with. So we are working at the corporate end. Typically our software works across large networks. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of today is, or for the rest of this session, is if you are complying with industry best practice standards, which are typically what compliance standards are all about, are you likely to be more or less secure as a business? Intuitively, you'd expect to be more secure because you're following best practice. But what we're increasingly seeing in the market is, because this is such a complex, time-consuming and challenging task to audit your networks, some people are going down the road of saying, I've ticked all of the boxes in terms of my industry standard, and therefore I am secure. But there's a great difference between being compliant to a standard and actually secure. And the main reason for that, of course, is that the cyber threat landscape is expanding exponentially, both in terms of scale and complexity. And whenever you take an audit at a point in time, you're only looking at the threats that exist on that day, or the best practices that exist for that day. So what we're seeing is that it can be argued that governments and standards bodies are actually driving global cyber defense down the compliance-based auditing route, because most companies are not information security experts. You know, they make and sell stuff that isn't anything to do with information security, but it's mission critical to them, so they're increasingly attending to the issue. But if somebody comes along and says, if you can audit your network's performance against a set of industry standards and tick all the boxes, you've gone some way to achieving best practice. But there's a whole bunch of other things that need to be done, and the bulk of what I'm going to conclude is what William mentioned at the very start of today's event, which is you have to take a holistic approach to information security for it to be effective. So what we're seeing is that some organizations are actually putting themselves more at risk simply by going through a tick box compliance approach rather than doing a continuous, systematic audit of their actual security vulnerabilities. And so compliant organizations can and do fail in the security of duty care. I mean, if I was just to look at publicized network breaches in the last few weeks that have appeared in the media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, these are not companies that don't take information security seriously. In fact, information is their core asset, and yet they've all suffered breaches. And so if companies of that scale and that interest in securing their information are being breached, you can see how complex a challenge it is for the whole of industry. So the one thing to say about compliance standards is there are a plethora of them. We're at the early days of trying to get to grips with these problems. Some of these are generic, like ISO. Many of you will be familiar with 27001. It's a generic information security standard that applies to all types of businesses. That's the security standard, for example, as a business that we operate to. Many of them are industry specific, like PCI mentioned. Some of them are country specific. So many of these, for example, are American standards. STIG, for example, is a military and security agency standard that we have to embrace in our software capability. So there's a compliance challenge. I saw a report recently that said that if you're an international organization, in other words, if you operate across several foreign markets, it's likely that you might need to be complying with up to 600 different regulations and laws in the information security space. That's a very significant challenge for any company. And of course, that burden goes hand in hand these days with the increasing tendency of government to become active in penalizing organizations that don't take information security seriously. And as you may know, there have been some high-profile reports of significant fines by the ICO in this country for companies that breach compliance. And at the same time, the compliance piece isn't fixed, because you could be compliant today, but because this environment is so fast-moving, you could be uncompliant tomorrow. So it's not like an MOT test with a car where you can do it once and get on with driving your car. The analogy would be that if your car was being attacked several hundred times a day by somebody who wanted to either break it, steal it, hijack it, or take it completely out of commission, that's the kind of challenge, which is why periodic compliance audits are useful, but don't fully address the threat. If I'm just kind of back that up in terms of what we're seeing with companies who are trying to get to grips with all these issues, even the chief executive of the Information Security Forum is saying that his members, these are companies who are actively trying to get to grips with compliance and security auditing, are saying that they find it difficult to know what exactly they should be complying with and who the body of authority is. So it is a very complex issue. On top of that, if it's challenging for a company to comply with industry standards, these figures would suggest that it's not making a massive impact in terms of the day-to-day vulnerability of companies. PricewaterhouseCoopers, in connection with the government, actually runs this survey every year of information security breaches. And as you can see, 93% of large organizations experience some kind of a breach, 87% of small, and they can be very costly. If you're working inside the industry, you know that those figures are actually underestimating the scale of the challenge, because the truth of the matter is just about 100% of organizations experience some kind of security breach a year. So am I saying that just by being compliant is a waste of time and effort and money? No, because what we know from research is that if you have gone to the trouble and expense of meeting certain best practice industry standards, you're much more likely to be secure. Or the cost to you of a business by being compliant in information security is much lower than not being compliant. And this American survey, for example, that looked at 46 multinational companies, found that it's actually 3 times more expensive for a business to be non-compliant as to be compliant. And I mentioned that the number of fines that government organizations like ICO are going up and up. I mean, they increased by 100% from last year to this, and I'm sure that trend is going to continue as more and more security breaches become public and more government focus goes on to what those companies are actually doing to protect citizens' data. So compliance alone is not the answer. And Thomas Jefferson, who you will know is one of the founding fathers of the US, once said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And what we're saying today is the price of security is eternal vigilance. The only way you can effectively address this problem is to continuously audit your networks for security vulnerabilities alongside adopting best practice, which is typically through industry standards. So we said that cyber threat is dynamic, it's fast moving. Cyber criminals frankly don't care whether you are ISO 2701 compliant. It makes no difference to them because they look today on what the specific vulnerabilities in your network are and exploit them. And if you are following best practice, it makes it slightly tougher for them to penetrate your network potentially. But they're only interested in specific current vulnerabilities. And so the only way you can address the security of your network is to be continuously auditing your network security arrangements. And what I would say finally is we have a lot to do with government in the UK and the US in terms of the work that we do. The message that we're trying to get out there is that you need to use compliance as a baseline. In other words, this is the very basic thing that you ought to do, comply to best practice standards in the industry. But beyond that, there's a whole of a lot more to do, and that comes back to the holistic approach that William was mentioning earlier. Thanks very much.